now is the COVID-19 pandemic and its negative socio-economic effects, exposing the legacy of apartheid in our country. Angelo Fick, the Director of Research at Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute, joins us for this discussion. Angelo, good evening. And a lot has been said, particularly around the discussion we are having tonight. South Africa is really an unequal society. It's not a new thing. We've been hearing about this for decades now. And you then look at a fight like COVID-19, and this pandemic has once again really laid bare the inequalities of South Africa. And when you listen to a caller like Ronnie then saying that it's in the hands of the people, and yet some communities are battling to, social distance, how then do we begin to, have a balance here?
Good evening, Bongi. So I think it's important for us to recognize that we did indeed inherit the spatial logics, the arrangements and inequalities of colonial and apartheid South Africa, and some of those have been intergenerational. But I don't think we should discount that we have also built an unequal society over the last 25 years, and it is far too easy, and I think also false, to suggest that contemporary South Africa looks the way it does simply because of apartheid and colonialism. I think what has since happened since 1994 is that we've continued to build in a neoliberal global environment an unequal society where those who got in on the political bandwagon often enriched themselves, those who got rich under apartheid often kept those riches, those who got access to resources under colonial conquest kept them, and those injustices remain part of a very vague notion of history. And so when we look at contemporary South Africa, by all means, we cannot deny that apartheid continues to blight the landscape in very literal spatial arrangements for poor and rich people, for black and white people to a large extent. But we must also remember that many of the failures to undo that legacy lie in the hands of post-apartheid governments, one after the other, from 1994 to 2020.
And what about, South Africa's investment when it comes to education? Because that has also been another sector that has really exposed us, particularly during this pandemic again.
So the crisis in education is a longer-standing crisis that I think, as you point out, the pandemic has shown what unequal inputs and unequal outcomes we have invested and reaped over the last 25 years. So again, it's very easy to talk about colonial and apartheid legacies, but we are now sitting with young people in school at the most senior level of basic education who don't know apartheid in its legislative form, who were born after 2000s, who are really post-millennial children of post-apartheid South Africa. And therefore ministerial responsibility, education department official responsibility, is the failures of textbook provision, the failures to meet the basic norms and standards, the failures to provide adequate buildings, proper sanitation. These are not the failures of 1985 or 1976. These are the failures of 1994 to 2020. And there I think it's crucial for us to, hold the minister to account, hold the president to account, hold government premiers to account, because they're the ones who are responsible for budget allocations. They're the ones responsible for not holding people to account when they are engaged in maladministration or in corrupt activities. And much of the blight that many, many poor people have suffered as a result of poor education is not the consequence only of apartheid and colonialism. It is the policy failure, implementation failure, corruption, maladministration, in a variety of sectors, not just government, but inside teachers' unions, in the sale of posts through principal connections. But infrastructure failures are principally that of the state. Curriculum development failures are principally those of the state.
And I'm sure, a lot of people that are talking about this conversation of inequality always say that we need to be having a different conversation around inequality in South Africa, and particularly not, looking at how we have been trying to address it as a country. Do you agree with that?
Yes. When we talk about inequality, it tends to be in a very narrow range. So there's this idea that there will be trickle-down economics, that if you simply, pay people properly at the top range, it'll trickle down to the poor. That trickle-down economics failed in the 1980s around the world, through the 1990s and the structural adjustment programs of the neoliberal World Bank and International Monetary Fund programs. What we have in South Africa is the largest wage and wealth inequalities in the world. Now, ordinary people don't have control over this, but managers and owners of corporations and of businesses, they have the responsibility to pay people a living wage. The gap between the highest and lowest paid employees, even in your sector, Bongi, in the media, is one that does need to be addressed, does need to be looked at. We cannot suggest that we're going to have inequality addressed when we have income inequality in all of our organizations, across all of our institutions, both in the private and in the public sector. If you look at government advertisements for jobs, you know, the job gap for people with ordinary skills, often below 100 or just over 100,000. And the job for people at the top echelons who are often deployed cadres, whether of the Democratic Alliance or of the African National Congress, they tend to be above R1 million. Look at the income inequality between the median wage in South Africa and what our members of provincial legislature, members of the National Assembly and others earn. Those gaps are rife across the country, and the consequences are that the inequality is then inherited. What that sends a signal to people is that no amount of education, given our graduate unemployment rate and also the graduate unemployability rate because of the poor education outcomes in both basic education and parts of higher education, are such that people have no option but to begin to realize the rational choice is education does not get you out of poverty, but forms of corruption and the varieties of misconduct that implies, that's what's going to get you out of the trap of poverty.
And we've seen concerns around the economy, of course, around this time. We're expecting a further contraction. The second quarter figures are going to come out, certainly not going to look like a pretty picture. Do you think once South Africa finds itself on the other side of this pandemic, things could get worse?
Well, the other side of the pandemic at the moment is a fantasy that we all share, hope for, pray for, work towards. What I think we have to do during this pandemic is to undo some of those legacies, some of those problems. How we engage in economic activity, that has to shift. So the idea of building shiny, bright objects that make us look like we're first world while hiding the shame of inequality, that doesn't work. What we need to do is create the kinds of projects that have longer lasting employment and are focused on employing more and more individuals. So automated systems may work very well in Sweden. They don't work really well in South Africa. But an automated teller machine at a bus station is taking a job away from somebody. And here I think we need to learn from the developing economies in the 1980s and 1990s of Southeast Asia, of Southern Asia, where job priorities drove the development angle. And there it is that you don't just have, a sense of creating efficiencies for the profit makers. You have to start creating employment, because that way, in the capitalist system, whether you like it or not, you then create a market of potential consumers who can consume the products that are being made. But if South Africa remains an extractive, export-focused economy that provides either goods, raw materials, or services for an export market, but does not develop its local market by providing a growing middle class, what we'll see is a continuation and a worsening of the effects that we're beginning to see and have seen the spectacular results of in this COVID crisis, that people will go hungry because they don't have income, food prices will rise, you'll see an inflation, there'll be increased turning out of people from rental properties, people who are backyard dwellers will find themselves suddenly homeless, and this is kind of a social crisis in the making that is hidden at the moment, I think, from many people's eyes, because they assume that this is simply a disease, it'll be solved, and then we will go back to the way things were. We can never go back to the way things were, and that's a global phenomenon, whether in large industries like the airline industry or whether in travel and tourism, if we're going to start looking at quarantine mechanisms, or even just at the level of service provision and goods and services circulating via the usual global supply chains that existed before the COVID interruption.